There are two sketches by Hans Holbein which are said to depict Anne Boleyn. One is in the British Museum, whilst the other is in the Royal Collection. The latter sketch is the more controversial, as the sitter is in a state of undress, has what appears to be blonde hair and a decidedly full double chin, all factors which seem at odds with Anne Boleyn, and yet the inscription labelling the sketch as her is believed to have been added by Sir John Cheke, a man who personally knew Anne Boleyn, or did he? In today's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast, I am chatting to Emma Demerath, who recently graduated from John Cabot University in Massachusetts with a degree in art history. Emma has written a thesis, the culmination of 10 months of research, looking again at this Holbein sketch. In so doing, Emma has discovered holes in many of the conclusions the historians have made in relation to this piece of art, but moreover has examined the imagery on its reverse, which has been largely ignored, but may very well hold the key to identifying the actual sitter of the piece. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 44, re-evaluating Holbein's sketch of Anne Boleyn with Emma Demerath. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast, Emma Demerath. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Adam?
I'm very well, thank you. It's very sunny in the UK at the moment, which is rare, to say the least at the moment.
I'm sure it's quite sunny over here too. Yes. But we're in New England, so maybe we're synced up today.
Yeah, hopefully so. So before we get into the discussion, the reason you're here today, and I'm really excited for our discussion because it's ultimately about Anne Boleyn portraiture, which is a subject about which I'm really interested. But just to get to know you a bit better before we get into that discussion, so can you just tell me a bit about your background, so where you grew up and what you're currently doing full-time?
Absolutely. So I grew up actually at a private school in Western Massachusetts. My father is a musician. Both of my parents are teachers as well. And I've always been an artist for pretty much as long as I can remember. So, I guess at around age 13, I started reading Philippa Gregory books, which I'm sure a lot of people, that's how they all got into Tudor history. And then from there, I was really introduced to Holbein because I wanted to get into, besides the fiction, what these people actually experienced, what they lived through, branching away from sort of this narrative-based historical thinking, which is all fun and good. But I wanted to get into the facts. So from a young age, I started branching into doing various copies of Holbein and Lucas Hornbout portraiture of all of the wives of Henry VIII. And then from there, I decided I wanted to go into art history because I knew I had a passion both for the Tudors and for creating art that I wanted to pursue. And so after COVID happened, I was 18. I was at a school that I didn't love so much, and I figured I've always wanted to get out of the US. Why not try for Europe? And I applied to one school and I got in and we made it work. And so I was in Rome for the past 3 years, sort of hopping around and getting to know a lot of different periods of history. I ended up sort of falling in love with both sort of late Renaissance artwork and also early Baroque. And sort of towards the end of my student career at John Cabot University, I wanted to bring back in my love for the Tudors because I knew even while I was studying all of this old Italian art that was something that I ultimately wanted to come back to. So that is my plan to do grad school somewhere in the UK. That's the dream, and I'm very excited to pursue that further.
Amazing. Did you learn the language whilst you were in Rome?
So the funny thing about me is I'm really good at accents, but
Okay.
languages I can't do as well. But I was able to sort of fudge it a bit by working on my Italian accent and very basic conversational stuff. So I think my Italian friends would probably be convinced I knew a little bit more than I actually did. So I can understand a good bit, but speaking, oh my goodness. And it was
Yeah,
an
it's a
American
hard
school.
language.
Yeah, right?
So, what sparked your passion for Tudor history? Was there a particular moment when you were young that sort of sparked this passion for Tudor history?
It's really hard to pinpoint a specific moment. I mean, I guess I could talk more about Philippa in terms of just sort of going through, like antique bookstores and thrifting and finding all of those, the Red Queen and picking that up.
Hmm.
And then doing a little family history digging, I found out my family is descended from the Coffins. And I discovered, and this was really a turning point for me, that I was related to William Coffin, who was Anne Boleyn's Master of Horse. And
Amazing.
also, I know, and also his wife served her in the Tower. And so that was like just finding these very tangible ways to link ourselves to the past is something that I've always been
Yeah.
interested in. And so when I managed to find a connection to the Tudors and how obsessed I was both with these stories that feel like they're straight out of fairy tales. They're straight out of fiction, and yet they're so real because they're so dramatic and powerful, and you just have so much empathy for these women specifically
Yeah.
that have been dead for so many centuries and yet still feel so real. So I wanted
Yeah.
to know them a bit more, I felt.
Yeah. What an amazing connection
Yeah,
to
isn't it
discover that
cool?
you've got that in your family's history.
Yeah. I thought that was very interesting. I think we're descended through his brother, something along those lines, but going back
Okay.
and discovering that is so cool.
Yeah. My dad did our family tree a while ago, and we discovered that my direct um, ancestor was a man called Sir William Pennington, and he was my time 16 grandfather,
Oh my gosh.
and he was murdered in a church in Westminster for speaking out against the Boleyns, and actually it's depicted in the Tudors.
What?
Um, yeah,
That's,
so
and
there is
you have the last name as well. You've still got that very,
yeah,
that's
still got
crazy.
he's direct my 16 times
Oh my
grandfather.
gosh.
Um, so we discovered that, and I was really excited. I mean, I didn't particularly like the Tudors. I thought it was fluffy nonsense most of the time, but I was quite excited that my ancestor was portrayed on it,
There's
I
nothing more
suppose.
exciting than that. Oh, it's so cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you could pick a single moment from history to go back and witness, you can sort of jump in a time travel machine and go back. What would it be?
Oh, wow. I think my answer is going to be similar to a lot of people's answers at this moment, especially with what's recently been released. But I want to go back to the princes in the tower and figure out what really happened,
Mm,
especially with the uncovering of those new documents where they may not have been killed. I just think I think Richard III as a person, as a character is so fascinating. And to finally
yeah.
have a once and for all definitive answer on what happened. I mean, how cool would that be? There are too many
Yeah.
unknowns. That's really the big issue in what we're studying here, all of the unknowns.
Yes,
But yeah,
massively.
yeah.
And do you have what I suppose we could class as a controversial Tudor opinion?
Controversial Tudor opinion. Hmm. I'd have to think. I think that speaking of Richard III, I think sometimes our own opinions and who we want people to be sometimes affects sort of the narrative that we want to enforce.
Yeah, of
And
course.
so for Richard III, I know there's a whole society based around him, and I read the whole book that with Philippa Langley,
Yes.
yes, who where she discovered it and his body in the parking lot under the letter R, or I think it was under the letter.
Remarkable.
It was incredible, and
Yeah.
I want to believe so badly that this is another misjudged figure in history. And so I think pulling away what we want people to be and who they actually are is a very interesting thing. But if we're talking about the facts, like yes, it is the most likely scenario in which Richard III did kill those two princes. Um, because he was the one who had the most to gain. And so when I see people talking about Margaret Beaufort and Facebook comments, all because of that television series, The White Queen, I want to bang my head against the wall, because at a certain point we have to be realistic about things.
Totally. And I think part of the problem that I suppose you have with Philippa Langley in particular is that she, is a complete Ricardian. She's a Richard III devotee. And so the facts, I suppose, for her, unless they align with what she's thinking, she really struggles to accept it. So it's kind of a challenging one, I think, in that regard.
Well, what's interesting is I do really get where she's coming from.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
I mean, the evidence is quite compelling.
It is. It's so interesting. And for me, I was going through something very similar when we'll talk about my thesis, but I went into this thesis really wanting it to be Anne Boleyn, really wanting to believe that this drawing was of our lost executed queen. And it was disappointing for me, I think, to have to transition from wanting to believe something to going into factual-based evidence and acknowledging that what you want to believe isn't necessarily what is going to be true, and just always not being afraid to consider and put into question what other much more famous, much more successful historians have discussed, because I did find a significant amount of holes in these arguments that in the past I would have been happy to accept. But when you dive a little bit deeper into the research, and when you go and embark on, a 10-month project like I did, you do find a lot of really interesting stuff, and you need to be able to put opinions aside and just
follow the facts.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, that is a beautiful segue into our discussion today, which is primarily based on a thesis that you've written, which is at its crux mostly looking at a sketch by Hans Holbein that has for a long time been identified as Anne Boleyn. There are a couple of sketches by Holbein that we think could depict Anne Boleyn, but the one we're talking about today, I suppose of the two, is the one that's the more contentious. So can you just explain specifically which Holbein sketch we're talking about and sort of and what it looks like?
Absolutely. So today we'll be discussing the Royal Collection Trust's portrait that has been recently, as of the 1983, identified as Anne Boleyn. More sort of research has been put out recently by Dr. Owen Emerson, Dr. Kate Hurd, the Tudor trio as a whole, discussing this portrait. What's really fascinating about this portrait is that it depicts a woman in very informal dress. So it's been sort of dated precariously between 1532 and 1536. She sort of depicted 3/4 up and at a slight angle with a double chin, sort of a coif, and a beautiful, beautiful fur nightgown as she sort of gazes down past where the image cuts off. And the really interesting thing about this portrait that caught my attention at first is that it is the only one out of this book, the great book by Hans Holbein the Younger, to include a recto verso. So it has an image on the back of the portrait that has been severely, severely overlooked. I mean, even to this day, if you look on the Royal Collection Trust website, the only little blurb that they're talking about this beautiful recto verso says that that it has been identified by Claire Stuart Wortley in 1930 for the Burlington Magazine as the Wyatt family crest, and that there is no reason to believe that the portrait on the other side has anything to do with that verso image. And that is the point where I read that and I said, I have something here, because why are they not mentioning the Wyatt family crest? Why are they saying that this image likely was added to the portrait after Anne Boleyn's death? They're dating it around anywhere from 1534 to 37. But why are we not talking about the fact that the Wyatt family at this time had just gone through a very, very narrow missing of an execution. I mean, the patriarch of their family, Thomas Wyatt, who by 1537, which is when Clare Stuart Wortley and when even the Royal Collection Trust also lends credence to, he had inherited his family's title. His father had just passed away. He was about to embark on a diplomatic mission to Spain. And yet he is commissioning this new family crest. And it's on the back of a portrait of Anne Boleyn. So why are we so tiptoey around this? That's sort of my big branching off point, when I knew that this had needed to be discussed more, because even in David Starkey's research, it's brushed over. Truly the latest and really only source that I could find that talks about both the recto verso, or both the verso and the actual portrait itself, was Clare Stuart Wortley's article in 1930. And that felt like a travesty to me, because how are we talking about the portrait and not what's on the back?
Yeah,
that's
totally.
Really,
I mean, until reading your thesis, I had no idea there was anything on the back.
I know. Isn't it crazy? It's the only one. It's the only one in 60 to 80 drawings in this great book that has anything on the back. And why are we not talking about it? Because it doesn't fit this very narrow perception, because it raises too many questions. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So sorry, it gets me passionate, because I just couldn't believe it that I'm this undergraduate student who is just trying to find something compelling to write about, and I felt like I stumbled upon something much more compelling than I had even dreamed.
Which is the sort of the gold mine that you want, really, isn't it?
Exactly. I know it is.
And we'll come on to discuss the verso in a bit more detail in a bit. But the other, I suppose, there is a second sketch by Holbein that's also said to potentially depict Anne Boleyn, that's held at the British Museum. So can you describe that one to us, just so for people listening, if they think they've seen it, so that we can have that sort of distinction between the two?
Absolutely. So you're referring to what I talk about in my thesis is the Bradford portrait, and that is currently in the collection of the British Museum. It is also believed to be by Holbein, anywhere from that time period of 1532 to 35. It's also on this beautiful pink prepared paper with different colored chalks. It's sort of flipped, so the woman in this drawing is facing the opposite way. She's facing towards the right. And interestingly, she's wearing an English gable hood, which I think for a lot of people doesn't align with who they think Anne Boleyn would have presented herself as. And up until the 1980s, even in a lot of the sources I was looking at, because they predated the 1980s, people are referring to this portrait as Anne Boleyn. And that is largely because of Wenceslaus Hauer, which we can get into. But this sort of became a pattern of portraits of Anne Boleyn due to his 1649 association of this portrait, and then subsequent etchings that he did of this portrait as Anne Boleyn. And this woman is much more fashionably dressed, wearing what appears to be some like a 3-ringed necklace. And her, I mean, I hate to impose modern ideals on these old drawings, but this would fit along more with what we would deem to be an attractive woman as compared to the other portrait.
It's funny, isn't it, with Anne Boleyn portraiture, they kind of fall into, I mean, with the exception of the other sketch with the big double chin and everything, all of the other portraits kind of fall into two camps. They kind of either look a bit like the National Portrait Gallery portrait with a very pointed chin and the bee necklace, or they kind of look a bit like the other Holbein sketch where she's in the gable hood. And actually, I think that this sketch, the one that you refer to as the Bradford sketch, the one that's in the British Museum. We
can say British Museum. I was trying to be very specific because there are so many different Annes in both of the collections that my professors and I decided on that one, but we can absolutely refer to British Museum and Royal Collection Trust.
Yeah, but with that particular sketch, it does to me, and I've always felt this, it looks more like an actual human than
absolutely
the National Portrait Gallery portrait, and even more so the Hever Rose portrait, don't look like real people. Like the mouths are too small, the features are too angular. It's a bit weird. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't look, they don't look like real people in the way that the other sketch, that the British Museum sketch does.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you. And I think also this sense that is trying to be evoked in that first Royal Collection Trust portrait of swelling, of sort of this doughiness, that's really hard to capture in a sketch. And as talented as Holbein is, I understand what you're saying. And the lack of naturalism in that portrait has always sort of been something on the back of my mind where it doesn't quite line up. And if you'll see other people's attempts at restoring this portrait, if it had been a preliminary sketch, trying to emulate Holbein's oil painting techniques and making it into like an actual painting, you'll still notice that because of the proportions that are being pulled off in this drawing, where she's got a very long nose, but a very small forehead. You don't get a sense of the hair. There's a lot of swelling underneath the chin. There's just something slightly difficult, I think, for our minds to comprehend about this drawing, whereas the Bradford British Museum portrait, absolutely, you can immediately sort of perceive this person's features.
Yeah, and interestingly, there's a sketch which may very well be George Boleyn.
Right.
When you line it up against the British Museum sketch, there is a strong familial link.
There is a strong result. It's so interesting, isn't it?
Really
I know. I didn't have enough space in my thesis to include all of that stuff. I kept being told to cut it down and cut it down, but I did notice that. And in the museum catalog, they include that drawing of George Boleyn, the catalog for Holbein in the Tudor Court by Kate Hurd, which I consulted a lot.
So you refer to both sketches as the Windsor and Bradford drawings. Can you explain why you label them that way?
Yeah. So if you look up Royal Collection Trust Anne Boleyn, you will first get the drawing that I've been referring to as both the Windsor and the Royal Collection Trust portrait. And you also get a couple of other different entries. And so I felt like there was a need for an added specificity, which is why I labeled them specifically as the Royal Collection Trust Windsor portrait because of the location, and then the British Museum Bradford portrait because of the provenance. So that's sort of what I was going through, because I felt like it needed to be even more specifically with the British Museum. If you look up their Anne Boleyns, there are a lot of difficulties with the titles of these drawings that adds to the confusion, because there are so many different bits of artwork, both contemporary and definitely not contemporary, that pop up when you look for Anne Boleyn, and a lot of etchings after both of these portraits that adds to the confusion. So I just felt like there was a need for more specificity. Got it.
Okay. So with the Windsor sketch, the main subject really of today, the double chin sketch, when was this first identified as Anne Boleyn?
Well, the inscription has been there since either the 17th or 18th century. It's not 100% clear when it first appeared. It's believed that it was applied while in the collection of George II, but really not until 1983 when David Starkey and John Rowlands published their article that completely retreated the credibility of these inscriptions and identifications that were made originally by John Cheke, that this drawing started to be taken more seriously. So that it's still pretty recent.
Yeah, so the inscription in the top left of the sketch, it says Anna Boleyn, Queen. Yep. As you say, that's believed to have been added by Sir John Cheke, but during the reign of King Edward VI. But
not directly. Right. What's really interesting is that people keep saying there's a little bit of confusion when discussing these identifications, because the labeling is not in Sir John Cheke's hand. So these identifications were added in the 18th century. Some of them were added in the 17th century by Wenceslas Haller. There's a difficulty in discerning which are which, but in the 18th century, these were officially added according to a long-lost inventory list that Sir John Cheke compiled. And as John Cheke was a member of the Tudor court, as of Edward VI, as of the beginning of his reign, we associate him with knowing his court members, and as also a patron of Anne Boleyn, there is a considerable amount of familiarity that it is assumed that he must have had with Anne Boleyn, with her persona, and for her just general appearance. So that's really what the key thing was, that David Starkey was trying to perpetuate.
So, as you mentioned a moment ago, John Cheke was a patron of Anne Boleyn's, and it is that fact that leads many people to believe that, you know, the inscription, which is said to be was said to have been added by John Cheke, this man, so we're told, knew Anne Boleyn, he was her patron. So for many, it's kind of irrefutable proof that this is indeed Anne. But you convincingly argue that there are quite a lot of holes in this assessment. So can you explain what these holes are and why you think we should still be questioning that it is a John Cheke edition?
Absolutely. Well, one of the big arguments that David Starkey and Rowlands discuss is that there are 9 big examples of errors in John Cheke's attribution of identifications. That's something that Eric Ives brings up again in The Life and Death of Anne Boleyn. But the thing that Starkey and Rowlands discuss over and over again is that as a patronee of Anne Boleyn, Sir John Cheke must have known what she looked like. Above all of these other sitters that he is trying to identify, he must have known what she would look like. For me, I was diving through all of these different biographies and letters about John Cheke, by John Cheke. There's not a ton out there, but I was able to find a couple of different sources. I couldn't find anything that would have confirmed that John Cheke visited court before 1544 when he was appointed as a tutor to Edward VI. I couldn't find anything. It's believed that they corresponded via letter, but I can't find anything that confirms that they actually met in person. At the time that this portrait was presumably made, he would have been studying at St. John's College, I believe, in the early 1530s. And then as a Greek scholar, he would have been tied up studying ancient Greek diphthongs with his fellow academic Thomas Smith. That doesn't mean that he wouldn't have had any time to meet with his esteemed patron, certainly not. But I think that we need to be really careful about just assuming that everybody knew everybody, especially if the time in which John Cheke first officially came to court occurred 8 years after this woman's death, you know?
Yeah. So basically what you're saying is that it's entirely possible that, yes, he may have been a patron of Anne's, but he was probably one of very, very many and could have easily never met her.
Absolutely. I mean, we know Anne Boleyn was such a patron of both the arts and the academics. She had I mean, we don't know exactly how many patronees she had, but we can't just assume that she knew every single one of them, especially not one who rose to the height of his power until long after she had passed away. So something to consider.
Yeah. Which is it's a big thing to consider, because it is, you know, the argument that it's Anne Boleyn put forward by historians is based around Sir John Cheke knew who she was, knew what she looked like, that, and his supposedly, the fact that it was him who supposedly inscribed this sketch is seen by many as irrefutable proof. But based on what you're saying, if we can say with confidence that, well, we can't say for definite, but, you know, it's entirely possible that he never met her. So really that should be questioned.
Right. Especially, like, even if he did meet her, all of the information that we are using to accredit this drawing as Anne Boleyn is according to an inventory list written in John Cheke's own hand that we no longer have and has been used as of centuries ago, only supposedly. Like, we don't have anything firm to declare, like, yes, this is a valid identification. If this was John Cheke's own hand, if that was his handwriting and we knew that for sure and it wasn't added centuries later, then absolutely I would consider his identification of this portrait as being Anne Boleyn as far more credible than just all this different say-so, where it's supposedly this was attributed to John Cheke's labeling. Like it gets into dangerous territory where we need to focus on what we know for sure rather than all of this say-so.
You mentioned a moment ago the late Eric Ives, who wrote what many people refer to as sort of the Anne Boleyn Bible, and he disagreed with
Right.
David Starkey and John Rowland's comment. So what was Eric Ives' take on the belief that this sketch was Anne Boleyn?
Eric Ives definitely mentions the misidentifications that Cheke had provided in the past. But another key thing he brings up is related to the Bradford portrait that's in the collection of the British Museum, where he discusses Wenceslaus Hauer, who is a Czech artist. And while all of the works in the Great Book were in the collection of the Earl of Arundel in 1649, this Czech artist Haller was looking through all of these portraits, and it was the Bradford portrait that he chose to begin perpetuating as an image of Anne Boleyn. And what Eric Ives says in relation to that is that it seems that the other drawing had not yet been claimed as Anne Boleyn, or that Haller had advice that that the Bradford portrait was her, in fact. So those are the two key things that Eric Ives discusses alongside the multiple misidentifications, which should not be easily cast aside, I think.
I mean, I suppose part of the big problem, really, and it's something that drives us all mad, is that there are no contemporary portraits of Anne from life still in existence, right?
Yeah, no, it's very difficult. So for me, I was comparing the Most Happy medal a lot because it's believed to have been made at the same time. But of course, the functions, the medium, both of them differ very much. We don't know who the patron of either of these two drawings were. We don't know who the designer for the Most Happy medal is, although it has been posed, I believe, by Dr. Emma Cahill-Marone that the designer for the Most Happy lead medal was likely either Lucas Hornbout, who was the preceding court artist to Hans Holbein, or Hans Holbein himself. But either way, you have to assume that Anne Boleyn had some ability to choose how she was portrayed as a Queen of England. So I went through a lot of comparing of those two, as the Most Happy medal was really the only contemporary. I mean, it's not even a portrait. It's so abstracted.
Yeah, it's a damaged medal.
Yes, it really.
Yeah.
It's hard to compare, but you can pick out some key elements that are reaffirmed, such as her very ovular long face and she chose a lot of jewels to be portrayed in such a small little
and a gable hood as well.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's, again, it's part of the problem with Anne Boleyn portraiture is that no one portrait looks like another. I mean, if we look at every single portrait of Anne Boleyn, every single time the face is different in one way or another.
Yeah, it's infuriating.
Yeah, it's so frustrating. So we discussed the verso a bit earlier, but to come back to that, so the verso, aka the other side, the back of the sketch, it's a very unfinished sketch of some description. But as best we can tell, what was the sketch? What does it relate to? And does it tell us anything about who the sitter might be?
Absolutely. So a really interesting thing about the verso is that Claire Stewart Wortley, alongside her efforts with Archibald G.B. Russell, who at the time was an art historian and an officer of the College of Arms in London, they managed to identify it as distinctly a male coat of arms, which I think in this case has helped the Royal Collection Trust distance both the recto and the verso from one another, because it is decidedly a female portrait. It would be difficult to link those two. But there's something really, really key that shows an acknowledgement and awareness of the treasonous sort of reputation that the Wyatts were trying to defend at this time as a result of Thomas Wyatt's time in the Tower and his involvement in Anne Boleyn's, traitor trial. And that is the inclusion of a both a boar, which is a very common association with Richard III, and also barnacles. So there was this rumor that Henry Wyatt Sr., who was Thomas Wyatt's father, had been tortured with barnacles during Richard III's reign for supporting Henry VII. And this is really, really important because the sacrifice that the Wyatt family had made to prove their loyalty being brought up at this time, so much later, right after this big trial where they had almost lost everything, it seems pretty key, especially if you're considering that that this that this portrait on the other side is of Anne Boleyn, because why would either Hans Holbein or Thomas Wyatt give that a write-off to associate those two things together? They're very contradictory.
Yeah, that's so fascinating.
Yeah, aren't they? Yeah. He was the only one to escape that time in the Tower, probably due to his friendship with Thomas Cromwell. And yet he would immediately be okay with drafting his new coat of arms to show how great his family is and will be in such close proximity to the drawing of Anne Boleyn.
Yeah. So does it, I mean, would that then also potentially suggest that the sitter, if we're saying it's not Anne Boleyn, could it suggest that it was a female member of the Wyatt family?
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up, actually. Yeah, so one thing that Claire Stewart-Wortley mentions is that it's possible that it was either Thomas Wyatt's sister, or it was Thomas Wyatt's wife, possibly, which both would be very interesting because, again, we have to consider that male coat of arms. But also at this time, Thomas Wyatt, his wife, had borne him an heir, so clearly he should show some appreciation towards her, but they were separated, and they had a very rocky relationship. So that's something else to consider. But that before this portrait being Anne Boleyn had ever been taken seriously, those two possible identities had been posed by Claire Stewart-Wortley in 1930, and I think they should still be considered, for sure.
I mean, it would make sense, why would there be something so clearly associated with the Wyatt family? I mean, I suppose the difficulty, though, is also that there is this long-standing connection between Anne Boleyn and Thomas Wyatt, but again, I think in some respects history has kind of inflated what that was more than, I think there's much more to her relationship with Harry Percy than there ever was with Thomas Wyatt. So again, who knows?
Right. I just considering the proximity of that and the trial in which he had just so narrowly escaped with his head. Yeah. It's there's so much to dig into. It's really, really interesting.
So one of the things about this sketch, which many historians often cling to, is the fact that the sitter is in an apparent state of undress, and that this therefore suggests that the sitter must have been at the very highest rank, because why would someone, only someone of the highest rank possible would be daring enough to be depicted in effectively their nightclothes. You not only refute this, but you actually point out other examples of people far below Anne in status depicted also in this sort of state of undress. So can you expand on this and why you think that actually this argument should be put aside?
I think that it's very difficult to make such a broad statement about appropriate fashions for members of the court to be wearing when you're not taking into account what the function of a lot of these portraits would have been. So one really interesting thing that Dr. Kate Hurd mentions in her catalog of all of these Holbein drawings is that it's possible that this portrait was initially intended to become a miniature, which is something entirely new, because of how informal the dress was. It seemed like a very intentionally private,
personal item.
Yes, exactly. So possibly something to be given to Henry VIII. I mean, from there you could dig into how Henry VIII enjoyed his women to be displayed, whether or not he would have been enthusiastic about receiving such a gift, especially one that portrays this woman as so demure and just plain. And I don't mean that in terms of her appearance. I mean it in terms of her night clothes. Uh,
Mm.
she still could have included, I don't know, like a one of her crown jewels, like a cross necklace, or it's hard for me at least to compute this idea of such a private portrait when it just doesn't read as Anne to me. But yeah, going back into discussing informal wear that these people um, were displaying themselves as. The Sir Charles Wingfield portrait that was also a part of the Great Book is another really interesting one. There's this funny line that Kate Heard includes. She doesn't talk very much about it. She just says, "This portrait raises more questions than it answers." And I just found it so funny because I think that there's something brave in admitting that you don't know how to address something, and I think we could have applied that a little bit to this drawing as well. Um,
Mm.
yeah, I mean, it certainly raises questions regarding the purpose of commissioning such an informal portrait. I mean, this was a time when both Catherine of Aragon was still alive and that Anne was in a pretty tenuous position. She had just been crowned, she'd just been made queen, she had yet to provide an heir. She may have been pregnant with an heir at the time, we don't know. She was newly made Marquess, a person anticipating that coronation happening really soon. It's unclear why she would allow such an unflattering portrayal. Um, like the likely recipient for any future transformation of this work into a miniature is really interesting when we consider how she'd retained his attention through her wit, charm, and intelligence, like a significant depth of personality that doesn't correspond necessarily to her looks, that doesn't come across in this painting or in this drawing,
Mm.
sorry. We can't really easily discern that here. This seems like a very quiet, demure person, and that doesn't
Yeah, it doesn't add up.
yeah, and should a
Yeah, I
portrait of
think
a
that.
queen not be easily identifiable is another question that has been popping up in my mind. Don't you think that
Yeah,
Anne would be wanting to take this time to assert herself and assert her new power rather than, I mean, wearing her pajamas and allowing herself to be painted while she's got gout or scrofulous, like chins
yeah, it's
happening? It's
yeah.
just
I think that's part of the what I've always struggled with
right.
this sketch is that, and without wanting to be insulting to how someone looked, the sitter is let's just say it, she's plain. You know, the sitter is plain,
Mhm,
not particularly attractive,
mhm,
and the
mhm.
I suppose the thing that I struggle with this is that Anne Boleyn was famously quite vain. She was very fashionable. You know,
Right.
everybody, all the accounts talk about how stylish she was, how well put together she was. And this sketch just feels a million miles from what Anne Boleyn would have how she would have wanted to have been represented, which is why I've always struggled to accept that it could be her.
Yeah, I mean, she was known for that impeccable style and those trend-setting fashions.
Mm,
Honestly, such an image, I was thinking, could have even provided convincing evidence of like improper behavior at her trial. Um, if she was allowing people to be seen in that manner. Uh,
yeah, and that's never brought up.
right? It doesn't quite add up. So that was
Yeah,
another thing that I was considering. And also the miniature by Hornbout of Henry Fitzroy, um, who was Henry VIII's bastard, as we all know. Um, it's sort of brought up that it may have been sort of an allusion to his frailty, um, as he was suffering from tuberculosis, which would eventually sort of become his early
kill him.
demise.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's a lot of different sort of images, symbols, and illusions, and I say ALLUSIONS and not illusions, to be considered with this,
Mm.
and not just one being that only a queen could afford to take the risk because her
Yeah.
role wasn't all that cemented or secure.
Something else about it that, again, it sort of causes a bit of confusion is what appears to be blonde hair poking out from underneath the linen coif. Now,
Right.
this immediately rings alarm bells because obviously Anne is famously dark-haired. Some people have argued it isn't hair, that it's part of the headdress, or that, the colour may have faded over the centuries. What are your thoughts on that aspect of it?
Well, there was a really interesting video that came out recently that, well, by recently, I mean maybe in April, by Dr. Owen Emerson as he was interviewing Kate Hurd, and they did address it to a certain extent, where they're talking
Mm,
about the medium of chalk, how it sits on top of the paper and can be quite easily rubbed off. So that's definitely some that could explain it. Do I think it's interesting that a dark-haired beauty would have sort of golden strands in her hair to begin with? I mean, I don't know. It's up to the viewer. I think it is hair. I don't think it's
yeah,
part
I
of the
agree. I think it's
headpiece.
hair. The way it falls, it's hair.
Exactly. And there's discussion of there being evidence of sort of darker tones within the work towards the forehead and the cheek, where it hasn't been as rubbed out, as abrasioned, that would have sort of added to this effect of brunette hair. But yeah, I think that the hair alone is not a reason to discredit it as Anne. I think everything else we've discussed is.
Yeah,
That's sort of my conclusion from that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So ultimately, coming to an end, your conclusion is it could be Anne, but it could very well be somebody else. Um,
Right.
so the question is, who could it be? Do you have any ideas?
Well, we have talked just briefly about the possibility of this sitter being Catherine Willoughby, right?
Yes.
Just in comparison to this wonderful drawing you sent, I think there's something there to investigate for sure. I think for me, really, the conclusion I've come to is that a lot of scholars have suffered from this tendency towards exaggeration regarding these significant academic findings in order to generate public interest. And as we know, in this time, everyone's attention span is so short,
Mm,
that we're trying to come up with, I don't want to say clickbaity headlines, but we're trying to find concise ways to portray information that a lot of the time end up being really skewed towards opinion and not as much skewed towards fact. Um, and that's an issue, especially on TikTok, where a lot of historians are trying to find their footing there. Um, and yeah, I mean, again, like I want to emphasize, I would love for this drawing to be Anne,
mm,
but everything that I've come through, everything that I've looked at, everything that I have researched, it's not convincing to me. I think if anything, I have sort of come to a less satisfying conclusion because I couldn't convince myself that this was Anne Boleyn, because I don't have a set identification for who this portrait really could be. And I think for me, it's both very fascinating and also not satisfying at all, because there's so much more to be discussed and be talked about. And especially in regards to that verso, if the last resource that discusses about this verso is almost 100 years
mm.
old, I mean, clearly stuff needs to be done about that. It would be great to have some access to go in and sort of hands-on see this artwork, see the back of the artwork, which is not on display
Mm.
because, of course, the front part is. Yeah, I mean, it's all so faded that it's hard to identify, but that is exactly what we should be discussing, and that's what we should be focusing on. Not proving that this is Anne, but discussing all facets of this portrait of the recto verso,
Yeah.
to come to some other conclusion, and not just be convinced that it needs to be this long lost queen, because it could be someone just as interesting who hasn't been talked about enough.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think there is something in the Catherine Willoughby argument.
Oh yeah.
If you if
I
you
agree.
look at the more fleshed out, it's a sketch, it's not a portrait. But if you look at that sketch and you think about
Mhm.
the sketch that's labelled as Anne Boleyn, if that person was looking up and sort of out, there is a lot of similarity between the two.
I mean, I'm a portrait artist myself, so I'm very used to sort of sketching out everyone's facial features. And I think that allows me a different sort of perspective in terms of treating these sketches, because I both see an appearance, and I also see how just from this different angle, all of these images could align and form one person quite easily. I absolutely, the heavy lidded eyes, the not very defined jaw, and the lower lip slightly pouting out a little bit farther than the top lip. It's just there. I'm so glad you found that, because I absolutely agree that there is something there.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for coming on to discuss your amazing thesis and this fascinating sketch that, I think, to your point, we just still need to be asking the bigger questions about what, we don't need to just try and fit the mold that it is Anne Boleyn. There could be lots of other stories around it, and in particular, what's going on that verso. Absolutely.
I totally agree. And I just wanted to say, if anyone wants to follow my journey, I am currently working on restoring the Windsor portrait sketch as well. Just applying old Renaissance techniques. I studied Holbein's his sort of his journey through creating both these preliminary sketches and applying them to final portraits of paintings. I'm currently working on that on my Twitter. So if anyone needs updates for that.
So where can we find you? What's your Twitter handle?
Yeah, so it's just Emma Demerath, EMMADEMERATH, and I will be posting more on there.
Amazing. Well, again, thanks so much for coming on. This has been a really interesting conversation, and I think hopefully people will come away from it going, I need to go away and spend some time examining that sketch in more detail.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Adam. I'm really thrilled. What a great talk.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and a massive thank you to Emma for coming on and sharing her discoveries with us. If you like this podcast, then perhaps you would consider supporting the channel via signing up to my Patreon account, where I release a weekly subscriber-only podcast episode. This can also be accessed via Apple Podcasts. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, please do get in touch, either via Instagram or send me a message on Patreon. Thank you again for listening to the podcast, and speak soon.